everybody, welcome. There's like 3 or 4 episodes of television that every time I watch them, I am gut punched and just like inconsolable. Yeah. This one tops the list.
That he's created these sharp edges so that when you attempt to get close and violate his boundaries, that there's pain involved to let you know. Now, people do that verbally and emotionally as well.
It's something that when you are a little too early with intimacy, then it can lead to things like regret and shame and fear and guilt.
Thus, developing Joel's character in an insanely indirect way, in a way that makes it more universal and rich. So it's pretty darn well done. Hey everybody, welcome to the Prof. Noctis show. I am Evan, and I'm doing the introduction because, Wade, you've got a really special voice now. You're feeling a little under the weather. Why don't you introduce us to Mr. Gravelly here?
Hey everybody, welcome. Yeah, I've got this sultry voice today because the students at my university all assaulted me with their germs, apparently, and I'm paying the toll. So I'm going to try to clean it up for us. I'm drinking some nice orange Tazo tea and Hakuna Matata, apparently. We're going to do our best. So.
Well, thanks for rallying through for the sake of us being able to discuss.
Hey, the show must go on.
That's so true.
Must go on. Time rolls on, baby.
So today we're discussing Season 1, Episode 3 of The Last of Us as part of our semester show and our lecture play series. This is quite the episode here. I remember when this came out, you saying that this really was up there for you as far as television experiences. Tell us about that.
And even watching it again just immediately before we record this, like I just have to say it's an all-timer episode for me. Mm-hmm. There's like 3 or 4 episodes of television that every time I watch them, I am gut punched and just like inconsolable. Yeah. This one tops the list. It's alongside some of the best TV moments for me. And I don't know, man, like it is taken on its own. It's incredibly poignant and beautiful. Mm-hmm. But then in the scope of this series and what it means for the characters, I think it's just incredibly masterful writing and acting, delivery, everything. I mean, huge props to everybody involved with this episode. And so anyway, I say all of that simply to say to the audience, like, if you're just listening to these recaps, there is no way in heaven and on earth that we would be able to do it justice. Yeah. Because this is like one of the best episodes of television that's ever been created. So you would do yourself a favor to pause this, definitely come back to us afterwards, but go and watch it for yourself and to experience it, because you can see really what the fuss is about. But we are going to go through beat by beat through this entire thing. So
and let me add a little context too. Yeah. So if you've already paused it and you're coming back, hey, welcome back. So this is me stalling so that you have a second to pause, and there's a gap here. This is in a meta sense, this is the first part of the show that actually really subverts people who'd played the game. Yeah. So this, big time. Up to this point, if you've played the game, you have a pretty good idea of what's happening and what's going to show up. But this is not portrayed this way in the game. This story that we're seeing is told through a series of notes that you can kind of find, but I don't think you're required to in really any capacity. And so this is, I think, 4 notes in the game that there were.
Something like that, yeah.
And so this caught everyone off guard. Yeah. No one saw this coming in that way. And so I think it's part of what adds to the iconic nature and the impact of the episode is that even if you thought you were on the inside track, that you knew what was coming, this is where they showed you, no, we understand the way that The Last of Us subverts your expectations, and we're going to do it too in a way that perfectly fits and encapsulates the story and sets our characters up for where they need to go next. Absolutely masterful.
It really does. And you know, when I first watched this episode, I was comparing it to the game because, like, I had heard from pre-reviews and impressions that this was a powerful episode. And I was like, but the Bill and Frank saga in the game does not end super well. Like it's actually quite, it's not even heartbreaking. It's just kind of like sour, negative, pessimistic, kind of shows the harshness of the world. Whereas this really elevates themes of love, commitment, enduring and surviving and finding life in the darkest of situations. So, but it works. And I think it works well for both mediums. Differently, to differing effect. But like you said, this is the first real departure from the game, but it keeps the core and the heart, I think, which is important. It's like, only somebody that truly loves the medium can play with it like this. Somebody that loves the series and the story can play with it like this, and they clearly do. So
I understand it well too.
Yeah, that's
just
it.
to kind of cap it off. This episode really deals with the idea that love isn't something that we always choose. It can surprise us, and that love is that thing that, regardless of how calloused or prepared you are for the cruelties of whatever world you find yourself in, love is going to break down those walls if we let it in and allow us to live more richly, even in the middle of an apocalypse. So that's where we're headed, everybody.
We are heading there, yeah, for sure.
So let's talk about what happens. So we've been going kind of beat by beat through the story, and then we'll kind of talk about it. This one is a lot, so we're going to try and move pretty quick, so we're not going to linger on themes maybe as long as we will. But if you're interested in hearing more about those themes, or you want to hear us discuss or explore those with some more research, we'd love to hear about that. So drop that in the Discord, drop it in the comments on YouTube, and we'll take that and take the time. And it helps us kind of organize and figure out what folks might be interested in. So if you feel like we're moving a little too quickly through this, this episode really lets things linger really well. And so we're not going to have the time to do that to honor your time as the listener. So let us know what you want to hear more about. We'll just kind of be opening the door or window on a lot of things in this episode, but we won't be exploring them completely fully. So if you're like, I want more detail on that, we'll rely on you to let us know. So that being said, we open up the show. We have left Boston, and we see ourselves by this riverside. Now, I missed this really the first time that I watched. I'm a notorious two-screen watcher sometimes, where like the intro credits will fade out, and I'm still looking at my phone. If I'm honest, I'm still looking at my phone, and I look up. And so I missed this, or it didn't stick out to me in the first watch, is that Joel is sitting here by the river, and he's stacking these stones up. And it seems like maybe a little bit of a kind of a private funeral or memorial that he's creating for Tess, who we've lost. Wade, how did that sit with you?
I mean, it had religious studies all over it. I was like, you're making a monument and a memorial. And, you know, when you lack the modern day sensibilities of a civilized society, I love that they said we're still going to have Joel remember in his own way using the resources he's got right by the river, stacking up these rocks. And it doesn't even say that this is a memorial for Tess, but you know what he's doing. It's just powerful storytelling through cinema.
And I think it's visually putting to death his previous feeling of responsibility, because this episode deals a lot with who we're responsible for and what our purpose is. It puts to death some of his previous responsibility, and then he immediately walks back up the path, and then what we will know to be his new responsibility that he hasn't fully accepted yet as his charge. He's still on the fence, but visually he kind of moves back up the hill, and we see that. So it's an important contrast, I think.
When he comes back up and he sees not only this new responsibility, but in some ways, if they hadn't taken her on, Tess would still be alive. You know, and this is where Ellie cuts right to the quick. And I love the assertive aggression, but just the assertiveness of Ellie to say, hey, I got something to say. And Joel's like, no, save your sorries. And he's like, she said, I'm not going to say I'm sorry. I was actually going to say, you chose to do this. Nobody made you take me along. So don't treat me like it's my fault.
Yeah, don't blame me.
Don't blame me for something that I had nothing to do with. And it's like, and he just kind of nods because he knows, and she's right. But at the same time,
great point.
Grief and mourning all in one. So
yeah.
So what are you doing? She's just going to be cargo for a while. That's it.
She cuts through in the way that I think probably only a teenager is able to as well.
Yeah, for real.
There's very direct. You know, this is not my fault. But this is also a new experience for her. She's continuing to explore the world, and she seems to bounce back a little bit faster from this one than Joel. She's kind of used to it, but there's a lot of openness in the world. And they kind of explore as they're walking. They see a plane that is kind of really deteriorating, disintegrating. Obviously, it's been there for 20-something years. But she's asking about, oh, you used to fly in those things? What was it like? There's like a curiosity that's created. And as they walk down, they start to see some like older fabric, and you start to see is what looks like a bit of a mass grave, where the bones of people have kind of been left, and we're left wondering kind of what has happened. But Joel kind of starts to explain why they would be here and what was happening in the quarantine zones. But there's a connection there with Ellie and talking about the past. What stood out to you?
Yeah, we are experiencing the world and learning about the world through the eyes of Ellie. Just a smart move. She is our every person that we can all kind of glimpse the world through. And so Joel is sharing kind of like, hey, this is going to be a lot for you. And she's like, is it dangerous? And he's like, not really, but it's going to traumatize you to really understand this. And then when you see it all, and he explains, these probably weren't sick people. They just didn't make it into the QZ, the quarantine zone. Right. And Ellie is just like, and so they killed him? Why didn't they let him live? And Joel's kind of callous, practical answer is, you can't infect the dead. And so this was a safety security sort of situation. And that is just a brutal, sobering reminder. But it also reminds you that nobody knew what to do.
Correct.
And boy, if that didn't take me back to 2020 during our actual pandemics, like, yeah, some things were right and some things were not right, but nobody knew what to do. And everybody was doing the best with the information they had at that moment as it was rapidly changing. Just crazy stuff.
It illustrates the context and the way that these go down, depending on if you're in a big city, depending on what like a governmental response would be. You had a different experience. And so all we've seen so far is kind of these early stages and then this exact day of the collapse. But we'll continue to get these revelations into how different areas and parts of the country, depending on their leadership structure and regional characteristics and kind of cultural, the way that their cultures in the different regions of the country kind of reacted to and have the ability to adapt to what some of this is. So that is one thing that I think is important to talk about, because as we start to go west, we're going to get that. How did this, we know how it happened in Boston, and now we get a bit of a rewinding of time, and we get to learn how this happened in maybe a little more suburban, leaning towards rural community as we go back in time, and we open up with a man with long hair that we know to be Nick Offerman, who is watching some TV screens in what is this dystopian kind of future feeling thing where we're not quite sure, but we know that it's connected to when Fedra was evacuating or moving people to the QZ, because we see the same fabric on a woman holding a baby that we see on, unfortunately, the bones in this mass grave. Great
cinematic change there, just a subtle way.
Yeah, yeah, we know what it is. So as we open up, we start to get to know the character of Bill and learn a little bit about the town and the context. What was your first impression when you see him standing there in the glow of the screens, kind of backlighting or front lighting while we just see the back of his head there?
I mean, I'm pointing at the screen like Leonardo DiCaprio, being like, "Hey, that's that Parks and Recs guy."
Yeah, that's true.
But he quickly transitioned out of that. For me, it's always like, hey, I know that actor. What's he from again? And then a good actor is going to break that really quickly, and he does. And it's just like, oh, we've got a straight up doomsday prepper. And I think I texted you. I was like, this is my stepdad. He was ready. He had so much spam for Y2K, as we talked about a few weeks ago. But yeah, I mean, seeing this person that's been doing surveillance and prepping and all this stuff, it's like, he's ready. Maybe I need to be on his side when the world ends. And then,
well, he was right.
We know, things go crazy. He was right. Yeah, that's a good thing to say.
And that's I think challenging, but he was right. He was correct, and maybe the percentage chance of certain things happening, was low, but he went all in on what that was. We don't know if he saw this developing in some capacity in the world or if this is kind of how he had always been. But it's not really relevant because as Fedra kind of clears the houses and they're drawing the X's on with the spray paint, we start to see him holding his shotgun, waiting to see if they're going to clear him out. And then when they all leave, we get this kind of moment where he emerges from his lair, I guess you would call it. And he's like, gets that sense of satisfaction that he was right and they saw this coming and that now he was going to kind of have the whole town to himself.
It justifies his seclusion and his hermit-like lifestyle. So here's the thing. Like, it's not that he was right about the world was ending or the world was going to just catastrophize and everything. But it's more that he's justified in don't let anybody in, don't trust anybody. There's an emotional wall that he's built up. He gets to this a little bit later in the episode, and we'll certainly get into it, but he is made for this. And then this episode is about dismantling what he has always done as he calls it, a survivalist. And breaking down those walls to show what it means to live and thrive, not just survive.
But he understands that in order to really live, he has to be protected, and that he has to be have a plan. Now, do you think you could spend that much time by yourself? Everybody leaves town, and it's just you and a bunch of closed-circuit television, and you just get to split wood and make booby traps the whole time to protect yourself? How would you handle that?
I think that I could do pretty well, to be perfectly honest. It's a weird thing to say. Even though I have a very public-facing job and stuff, I'm really good and okay alone and secluded too.
I wouldn't make it.
I mean, I texted you during the show, and I was like, while we were rewatching, and I was like, this reminds me of the earliest days of like the pandemic, and like aside from the uncertainty and the disease and danger and all of that, those days where everything was shut down, I was actually kind of living at full clarity, deeply reflective, spending all of the time that I had just kind of doing self-betterment stuff. And it was pretty good for me. Of course, that, wore on and wore thin as the months went by. But
well, I think that was kind of the nature of it, is that we were profoundly aware of everything that was happening around us, but at the same time being unable to act on it or do anything about it. So I think it's natural to gravitate to the places that we have agency. And you cut to the quick on a lot of that in life in general. You want to understand what the purpose of something is. There needs to be some intention. There needs to be some structure. So I could see you doing very well in this environment.
Well, I mean, it strikes me, and you see this in the episode as well, that when you strip away all of the social constructs and the facades that we have to live into every single day, and you're left with the reality of what life is, who you are, what you're into, not into, and what was just kind of a play for show sort of thing, there's a level of self-actualization that can begin to happen. And what I realized during those days was, oh my gosh, how much have I been living for the society and community around me rather than for myself? And here we see this a little bit with Bill. He has isolated himself from community and fortified himself until somebody's able to break through and it's worth it.
Well, just like real life.
Totally.
Just like real life, right? When we think that we have it figured out, that we've got it done, our walls are up, we've got it booby trapped, we know how to protect ourselves and kind of that core being. Just like he physically is in that space alone, we can create those kind of barriers in our lives. And then something or somebody usually crashes in. And that's what we see here. The alarm goes off and he goes out to investigate. There was an alarm that goes off earlier and it was an infected. And it lets us know, what the traps are and that kind of stuff. But he could have made these traps to be lethal. Okay, and some of the traps are lethal, but in this context, they're not. And, I think that that's an important distinction, is that he wasn't really interested in doing harm. There was some element of him that said, you know what, I don't want to make this lethal in case it's not someone who's necessarily deserving of it. That's my interpretation, but...
Or an animal that he didn't want mutilated or something and he could use for food or something. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons, but for whatever reason, it wasn't to obliterate the enemy at this point.
But there are those. And this one is different. Not. If you're just walking along this path, you would fall into the hole, and if you try to get through his fence, we see what happens too. some raiders later in the episode. So we have now met Frank. So Bill is the character that played by Nick Offerman, and then we've met Frank. And so he walks up very cautiously to this hole, and Frank has about 15 seconds, so maybe a sentence and a half, 2 sentences to survive here. He's going to have to do that. So I'm sure that he thought about a lot of things and ways that he could get out of it. And true to his character, he just decides to be honest and genuine. And he said, this is my only shot, right? What do you think went into that decision? What decision would you make? And what do you make of this interaction?
Oh my gosh, I would completely overthink it. Like, what's going to get me shot and what's not? And how do I choose the latter?
Right.
And I love the genuineness, because when Bill asks, are you armed? He says, no. He's like, I thought about lying, but I'm not lying. I'm just, I love that. I mean,
yes, exactly.
For me, I would probably want to seem a little bit more together than Frank is. But also there's an endearing harmlessness to Frank as well.
And you get the sense that, like, Frank is wandering to be out here anyways, so he's got to have been contemplating that we could be nearing the end realistically up to this point. So this is a departure from wandering in the woods. He was hopeful that he might stumble on something. But he also says in later conversation, I haven't eaten in 2 days. Mm-hmm. It doesn't sound like a lot when you say it, but it's a lot as I've experienced it. And I think it goes to those kind of deeper reflections that he finds himself in. But they have this kind of weird interaction. And somehow Frank kind of breaks through. And eventually Bill puts this ladder in, and they have this kind of emerging interaction. How do you handle that moment from when Bill decides to put the ladder in? I think that's a distinct moment, right? And then from there, what does that start to do for their relationship?
Well, Frank has lost. He said that he had a party of 10, I think, and the other 9 have died. They're no more. And so he is fully aware of the risk of his own mortality at this point. And so when the ladder comes down, you can see it on Frank's face. I mean, he becomes very downcast when Bill walks away, and then when the ladder comes down, he's filled with a little bit of hope. And the gun is still drawn the entire time.
Well,
so it's like, okay, how is this going to happen? So Bill's letting him go. Frank says, I haven't eaten in 2 days. And Bill says, this isn't an Arby's. I love the Arby's reference. It's like perfect. I think that's the second one, because we've already seen the Arby's sign on the side of the road at one point. But Bill says, I am letting you go, and if I feed you, then every hobo around is going to show up for a free lunch.
Right.
And Frank is like, I won't tell anybody. Like, you can tell I'm an honest person. I can't lie and stuff. So moving into the home, I can only imagine that for Bill, every alarm emotionally and in his mind is going off. And it's like, this is not what we do. This is not safe. This is making me vulnerable.
It's so emblematic of the boundaries that we put up to the way that we live. Like we talked about, those facades that exist in the ways that we live our lives. Sorry, the dogs decided the facades that we put up in the way that we live. And so Frank has managed to kind of tunnel through those pretty quickly. And there are those people in our lives that we meet, and they're not always romantic. In this scenario, there is a romance that is going to develop, right? But it's not always necessarily romantic. And so you don't know kind of which way it's going at this point. So I think it's important to recognize there are those people that you meet that you just kind of connect with, who understand you from a different perspective in a different way, and they can either challenge or push or help you to grow, or really it's a very enjoyable relationship because you're not quite sure what's going to happen, but you don't feel particularly challenged. I think one thing that sticks out to me is this first time that Frank kind of challenges Bill's assumptions, because Bill has lived in this world where he has absolute authority, right? He's prepped. He's got the cameras around everywhere. He has put up every wall physically and emotionally that he could, probably from society for a long time, to be able to get to the point where he doesn't have attachments and he can survive here. But when he says, hey, this isn't an Arby's, everybody's going to come for a free lunch, Frank goes, Arby's didn't hand
didn't
out
do free
free
lunch.
lunches. Like he challenges
It was a restaurant.
Yeah, he challenges his analogy, and you can see that Bill hasn't really even had conversations like that. Definitely
Yeah.
not in a while, where somebody would say, "That's not really the right analogy." Which, in a life or death situation where somebody's pointing a gun at you, to like kind of pick at them a little bit and say that creates this rapport that I think is that first time, besides, when he gets out of the hole, that you see that this is maybe more than just an interaction between a survivalist and someone who's fallen into their trap that they've created. So they move into the house.
They move into the house, and just the vulnerability continues to come up again and again. I mean, you see Bill doing things to actually care for Frank before he actually cares for Frank. He provides him clothing. He gives him a shower, tells him 5 more minutes, you're fine. And then he makes this incredibly elaborate meal. I would say it's elaborate for like my standards, but certainly
It's
for
lunch.
the post-apocalyptic. Oh, and it's lunch.
It's not even dinner. It's
And then he's got like the full sommelier pour of the of the wine bottle. I'm like, holy crap, this is nice apocalypse, like high living. But it also shows like Bill is more than you thought he was. He's not just a survivalist.
Yeah.
He's somebody that does appreciate fine things in life. He's a person that can appreciate another person, but he's never allowed himself the opportunity to. Maybe because of that whole vulnerability fear. I think that is probably the piece that I come back to again and again. The wires, the tripwires, and the traps are all this extraordinary metaphor for the boundaries that he's placed around his own life, psyche, emotions, heart. He's never let anybody in, but here you've got somebody breaking through. And what is it about him? Maybe it's the way that Frank carries himself. Maybe it's the demeanor, the inquisitive nature, because he does ask a lot of questions and he's very genuine. But it completely dismantles Bill so that Frank can fully see him in a way that I don't think he's ever let other people see.
Totally.
Incredible.
Everything's been so sharp for Bill, and I think the barbed wire is a great example. I think flamethrower booby traps are probably an even more intense
Extreme,
example.
but yes.
We'll get they're alluded to when he goes to the natural gas plant and figures out how to get the power on. And we both noticed when he goes to the Home Depot, it's the old Home Depot logo from that time period, and we were both like, "Nice touch." And so there's all these things that make you feel like this is kind of a lived space. But when it comes to those boundaries, barbed wire is a great analogy, or as they call it in the South, bob wire.
Bob wire.
Bob wire. So when you try to cross a boundary, it doesn't just prevent you from moving, it harms you to let you know you're not supposed to go any further. And we get the sense that that's how Bill has presented the boundaries in his life, that he's created these sharp edges so that when you attempt to get close and violate his boundaries, that there's pain involved to let you know. Now, people do that verbally and emotionally as well. When you go into something, you go into a conversation, you hit on something that maybe is too deep for somebody. Sometimes you'll have an experience where they will lash out a little bit because they'll hurt you because they're starting to feel hurt or they want to be protective. That can be emblematic of there's a lot more going on the surface, or maybe we've violated a boundary. And then in some ways, when you do these boundary violations, some ways it's even more intense. Sometimes there's a flamethrower and you want to kind of figure it out. But it's a great visualization to his methodology and his thinking, and it's perfectly in line with the emotional state of his character. So I think it's really consistent. So when we've got that set up, and then Frank doesn't get that reaction. He tries to get through it, but Frank kind of knows how to navigate it. He's pulling that barbed wire apart. He knows where to grab it, where there aren't any kind of sharp edges. And so he's navigating this in conversation in a really interesting way. And it culminates, I think, most acutely in this moment around this piano. Yeah. Talk to us about this piano scene and why you think it connects so well.
Frank sees the piano and he sits at it, and he finds this Linda Ronstadt sheet music book, I guess, and begins to play it completely inelegantly. It's not that it's bad, it's just that it lacks the feel, the vibe. He's hitting a lot of the right notes, but it's completely inelegant. And but he's going for it because this is something that, hey, he knows this song and like we're connecting and stuff. And Bill says, stop it. Like, that's not like that. And he begins to take it away. But then when Frank kind of like points at the piano and says, go, just play it and then I'll leave. You get like maybe the most tearjerker, like lump in the throat inducing moment of the entire episode, because Bill begins to play this song and it's clear that he's singing longingly. Some words of the song, just like it's called Love Will Abide, or Long, Long Time, but it begins by saying, love will abide, take things in stride. Sounds like good advice, but there's no one at my side. And what a incredible opening to this with this theme. And then the entire song goes into this longing, waiting for the day, but all still kind of, holding everything dear. So he comes to a close in the song, and there's just a pause. And Frank says, who's the girl? And Bill says, there's no girl. And then Frank says, knowingly, I know. And this is just a subtle acknowledgement that he knows that he is gay, right? And they have this incredible moment. When I talk to students, and whenever, somebody's trying to let other people into their lives, I always say it's more about letting people in than coming out. And this is a beautiful moment of that, because like there's a moment of vulnerability that springs up, and you see Bill let Frank in to this, and it begins to snowball into everything else we see in this episode. And up to this point, he's let no one in. It is, to me, one of the most beautiful and truest depictions of vulnerability that I've seen on film.
There's a couple of things that I think really aid in that, and I think I just want to linger in that for a really long time, but we said that we can't do that. So we'd love to talk about this kind of stuff more. Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Linda. That I think really aid in that connecting. So one of those is that on the way to the piano, we find out it was an antique, and then he says it was his mother's. And so we, just in that statement, there's a lot more there. So it's starting to get some access to this tenderness that exists with Bill. So first we get that in conversation, that emotional tenderness. Then we find out that he goes through some sheet music, and he says this and this. What is this? Ugh. And so it's layered underneath like his mother and some family perceptions potentially. And then the true reality of who he is underneath the facade of what he put on top of those books. Because I think the order of the sheet music and where you put things and what you want people to discover or not discover, and if someone were to open it, what would they see first, are all things that someone like Bill would probably consider, because he's very detail oriented. He's very particular.
Well, so certainly nobody would have come in as well.
And so nobody's going to come in, but he doesn't want to let that part of himself out, because once it's out, then it's out, and he feels like he can't get it back, I imagine. And so then he goes underneath and pulls. He goes, "This is you." And so he's communicating subtly that he sees not just who's in front of him, but he sees the person behind, inside of him. And so this would probably be really difficult to craft and pace from a storytelling perspective, because it has to be believable that they would get this close this fast. So the kind of the longing that's underneath the surface needs to be communicated in a way that it was really strong, so that this is a moment to take the risk, because this is risk, right? This entire thing is Bill managing his risk. And as he kind of manages his risk and puts it in a different box and puts it in a different box, Frank is able to just slowly climb out of the hole and then out of the different boxes and holes that he finds himself in. And so visually, there's a lot that helps us believe that they're actually connecting, whereas it would feel too fast before. And I think his hands, Bill's hands, when he plays the piano in contrast to Frank's hands, is a great visualization of that, because all we've seen is rough tumble, chopping wood, loading guns, building traps, everything. We've never seen him be tender and thoughtful and deliberative in this way. And his hands are almost like a completely different character that I think
give. Wine bottle.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great point.
Yeah.
That's a great point. There's these moments of tenderness that we've been alluded to, and then now this is where we get to let the music and his voice kind of live it out to express what's deeper in his desires. And so it pays off. It feels emotionally and intellectually honest to me that they could be in this place given those scenarios. And that is really difficult to do. And it's what sets up, I think, a lot of the threads that really actually cinch it all together here at the end, just in this scene.
Oh, it's terrific, and I think that it takes Frank noticing these things and saying, essentially, hey, you've got this rough exterior and you aren't letting anybody in, but I see traces and hints that you want it. You want someone to break through this, and I'm here. And that's kind of where we go. This next scene really shows the level of vulnerability and intimacy that they are willing to share. And I love just a few lines in here where Frank is kind of setting some expectations. He was like, "Hey, I'm not the kind of person that is intimate with everybody. Okay, so if this happens, then I'm going to stay for a little bit." And Bill's just like, yeah. But it's just a great way of saying, and I even texted you, kind of in my world, we're always talking about things like consent. And this is a great discussion of like, hey, are we on board with this? Like, are you aware of what's kind of happening here? It's just a normal, natural thing. And I love a normalization of good consent talks. Well,
I think we talked a little bit how it's been something that writers, I think, have been steadily incorporating as I've been consuming media in my lifetime. A lot of the time we'd have these tender romance scenes, or the characters would passionately crash into romance, but there's these little pauses that are those moments of consent, because it's not just like yes, and then you open a gate and then you figure out what's going to happen next. There's these little moments along the way that they're communicating the entire time, both verbally and physically, that I think are model healthier behavior when it comes to these kinds of situations. And I think it's really important to have those modeled in media in that way. There's a show that I was watching just last night, a new episode of something. I won't say what it is just in case anybody's watching any spoilers or anything like that, but it's like my favorite show on television right now, hint, hint. And there were these micro moments of consent in this part of this episode. And they stick out to me in a way because I grew up in a time where I watched things where those weren't there. And so now you see some of this evolution in storytelling, and I think it's really, really important, because there's consent, but then there's also like the probing of boundaries, right? I think that Frank talks about that a lot. Hey, I'm gonna start slow. This is what we're gonna kind of figure some things out here, and so it's just a reflection of some of the tenderness that he's seen and probably come to appreciate a little bit with Bill at the piano in the way that they interact. And Frank knows that he kind of has to take the lead here.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I love that because it reminds me that love and vulnerability is not self-serving, self-seeking, but it really is about, hey, we're on this together and we're in this together. We're going to go at the pace we need to. That is so true. Have you ever heard the phrase vulnerability bomb, where somebody like in the middle? I
don't know if I have.
Typically, it happens when we are doing like a welcome, get to know you sort of thing, and somebody like it's like
too much, too fast. Okay.
What's your name? Where are you from? What's a fun fact about you? And it's like, oh, I like cats. Oh, I like that. And then somebody's like, when I was 5 years old, and it like explodes the entire group because somebody prematurely vulnerability bombed. Okay, there's no intimacy acclimation, I would say. Yeah, and it really diverts the trajectory. So I really appreciate when something like this gets it pretty right.
Intimacy acclimation.
Ooh, yeah,
is a great phrase that you just said.
I don't know.
It makes total sense for me in the context, but I'm writing it down.
Intimacy acclimation. Yeah. Well, and that's this is something that I've learned in my own life. Intimacy acclimation. I'm actually going to own that word now.
Now we're using it.
But it's something that when you are a little too early with intimacy, then it can lead to things like regret and shame and fear and guilt. But you have to acclimate to that sort of moment. It's the idea that intimacy is earned, and unearned intimacy leads to shame, regret, fear, and isolation.
No, that's so true. There's this moment too where you talk about facades, and I'm just going to keep using the word facade, right? These kind of masks that we'll put up, or these facades that we have. And so there's moments where you meet folks and you don't have any previous context. So longtime friendships are great, right? Like you see through each other, you know a lot of history, it's all great. But then there's something about making new friends and having new relationships where you can decide if you're going to let them know you through the facade or if you're not going to bother with that and just, you know what, if I need to know if we're either going to connect or we're not, and I don't have time to do this whole song and dance. So I'm just going to kind of let you know where I am and what I'm about. Now, the difference between that and a vulnerability bomb is probably the amount of people in the discussion and the context. Right? If you're at a get-to-know-you thing for a work function, probably not right. But if you're in a conversation where you feel like you want to try and put out some trust feelers with some folks to kind of have that intimacy acclimation, because intimacy acclimation is not necessarily exclusive to romance. No, romance, I think, goes through quicker because it goes to like a physical, emotional nature that like, friendship maybe doesn't in the same ways, or like they kind of overlap each other. But in even just friendships and relationships, we decide how much that we want to reveal about ourselves and the facades that we want to live into. And it's a theme in this show, Framed by the Apocalypse, that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on why we would choose to put them up with some people and why we wouldn't choose to have these walls or facades with others, especially as we kind of get older.
I think that to kind of go with the theme of this particular episode, sometimes you can't help it.
Yeah.
Someone has wooed you to the point. I don't mean necessarily emotional, like romantically, but I mean somebody has created space where you want to let them in a little bit more. And that becomes almost an irresistible sort of thing because, you know, I'm reminded of, I think Brene Brown says this, but that vulnerability is the
antidote.
It's the root.
Antidote.
It's the seed bed of acceptance and belongingness and love and all of the rich things in life. And so innately, all of us want that, but we don't want to go through the vulnerability to get there. It's for that reason we can't manufacture it. But there's some people where it's like, okay, your level of whatever personhood, identity, whatever it is somehow calling out to my level of personhood. And it's going to take vulnerability to bridge this gap, a little bit of risk taking. But I think that the connection on the other end of that is worth it and worthwhile. And that's certainly what we see with Bill and Frank.
Absolutely. And even in a restorative standpoint, which we'll get into now in this next segment, where Brene Brown would say vulnerability is the antidote to shame. It not only does it have the ability for us to connect, it actually has like inoculating and healing properties for us emotionally in our lives. So we get this time skip now. So we get 3 years in advance, and we go from that moment where they've really connected to they kind of bust out the door and they're in the middle of an argument. And this is so well acted because you fully believe that they're living into 3 years of life together immediately. It's insane.
I love it. And it's this mishmash of two competing cultures of the survivalist mentality of Bill and Frank saying, no, I want a life. I want a real life together. I want to paint the houses. I want to plant gardens and fix up the boutique and stuff. And
I want to have friends over. And Bill goes, what?
We don't have any friends. We're never going to have friends. Because, again, I've let in who I want to let in, and we're done. We're done. But Frank is like, there's more to life than just this.
Bill knows that Frank needs more in life than he's going to need. And so it goes to the depth of care as he's saying, this terrifies me. I don't want this. This isn't how I want to spend my time. I don't want to let other people in. But I recognize this need for you so much that I'm willing to break down my own boundaries again in other ways to let this happen. So we find out that Frank has been chatting with somebody on the radio, and Bill is like not okay with it. And then we quickly cut to this scene where here they are.
There they are. Bill and Frank are having lunch with Joel and Tess.
Almost like a picnic. They're outside having a very nice lunch together.
With a gun on the table the whole time pointed at Joel. I mean...
Which, and they use Bill as such a great insight into some of these more deep areas to help us understand Joel. And the timing of that is perfect because it's just about 20-ish minutes that we've gotten to live in this world. And yes, we've been learning about Bill and Frank, but immediately in that moment, we realize that they've been telling us about Joel too. And so we get to see some interactions with Bill and Joel. Joel says, I think you really liked the line, and stop pointing that gun at me.
Yeah, I love that.
But then he puts it in the holster under the table, and it's a thigh holster, so it's still pointed at Joel. It's just under the table.
I love that.
Which is great. So what do you think is important about this lunch and this interaction as we meet Tess? We also find out for context that Joel and Tess have been at least around 18 years. So that the loss of Tess, so we get the loss of Tess, the funeral in the beginning. We get this reminder of how long they were together here in the middle, and then it's revisited there at the end, a little bit of a preview. What's important about that, and what does this do to kind of further our story?
Yeah, well, I think you said it. I mean, you texted me saying, this kind of time frame for Joel and Tess. So it gives some longevity to their relationship. Yeah. And also, Joel has one particular line when Tess and Frank go into the house where he says, hey, I get it. And he stops himself because he doesn't really know what to say. Catch. I don't know if it's what he would want to say about Bill and Frank or about him and Tess, but he just simply says, if mine.
If mine
so did this, then I would be freaking out too. But it lets us know that even though there's some like murkiness as to their definition, Joel and Tess are doing life together. Like they are surviving in this together, whatever that means.
It's so true. And so to kind of, for the sake of time, they interact. Joel and Bill connect in some ways. There's some mutually beneficial relationship stuff there. We can trade. We can get you things you don't have. Joel kind of gets some credibility by saying, hey, listen, you have this kind of wire, and I have this kind of wire that I have access to. So he communicates in Bill's language, which is, I'm not going to harm you, and I can add value, but we're going to have a reciprocal trading relationship. So it is the closest thing that someone like this in this context is going to have to a friendship.
Yeah, it is. At least an understanding. And they may not have been friends in the regular world, but here there's at least a respect and admiration, and a utilitarian sort of mindset of like we need each other here.
And the utilitarian nature of mutual benefit in friendship is great. Like there's this trading, and that's what it is. But I think it eventually moves to trust, which we find out as they depart, and they talk about. Frank and Tess talk about codes that they might have on the radio. It's somewhat relevant, but it's kind of underneath some of these other themes. Yeah. So they then leave, and we kind of find out that these raiders are going to hit, right? That's where we get next.
Well, next,
the strawberry scene.
The strawberries.
The strawberries.
We can't go past that, So we find out that Frank has traded a gun, a small one, gun, for some seeds from Tess. And so he's surprising Bill because he's been secretly planting this. And he's got the first fruit of strawberries. So he's showing it to him. And you just get just like the cinematography, the music. This is the second time that I cry in this episode. It's just like, what is happening here? Because they eat these strawberries and they like do this nice little cheers with them.
Yeah.
And then they eat. And it's just like, okay, this is a non-essential in life, and yet it's so essential. And it's what Bill never would have experienced with the state of life that he was living. And that is a huge piece, right? And so then it gets even deeper, Evan. And it's like, this is the line that broke me, where he said, I wasn't afraid before you showed up. Bill says this to Frank. I wasn't afraid before you showed up. I'm like choking up now. It's like the most incredible statement because that's what vulnerability does to us. It's this moment of saying, I'm okay. But now when I've brought you into my life, everything is at risk. And yet, that's how you get the strawberries. That's how you get the fruit in life.
It is. I wouldn't have been able to experience pain in this level because I didn't have as much to lose. But now I have something to lose. So I have to focus on what I gained. And this strawberry is so emblematic of that. And there's just those depths of relationship and connection in life that you don't know exist until you take the risks.
And once you've experienced it, it's like, what was I waiting on? Like, this is so rich. But then the converse is also true. Sometimes you take the risk and it is filled with pain. And it's like, a love unreturned or something like that.
Yeah.
A vulnerability that is met with resistance. So it is a real risk, and I don't want to discount that, but you keep stepping up to the plate because this is the good stuff in life.
Well, and I'll speak personally for myself. I think that I thought that, you experience love as strongly as you've ever experienced it, right? And so you think that that's 0 to 100%, right? So you say, how much do you like or love this thing? You say, okay, well, this is the most I've loved anything, and this is like a midpoint, so this is kind of where it sits. Yeah. And so that becomes this kind of baseline. Then things happen in your life. Maybe someone falls into a hole, but maybe it's something different for you, and your capacity for love changes, grows, and expands. And so when that process is happening, I think it's exhilarating, but it's also very terrifying because it illustrates that you have something to lose. But it also means that you have a new baseline for the capacity to love. And so you're saying, what was it previously? What is it now? What is my commitment? And how does this interact? And how do I manage this in a way that I don't get hurt? I'm really setting myself up for a lot of pain here, so this really has to be worth it. And so as that capacity for love increases, it changes what the stakes are, and this is illustrated really well by the strawberries and immediately after, but the threat to their relationship.
The threat before we get to that, there's one other line in the strawberry patch that Bill says to Frank. And, he's kind of been moved by this gesture of planting strawberries. Yeah. And it's not something that he ever would have done. But he says to Frank, hey, I'm sorry that I'm getting older faster than you are. And Frank responds, older means we're still here. And that moment of just like Bill saying, I'm getting older than you. And it's this fear of like, who's going to protect you? Who's going to do this if I'm gone, first of all? And then secondly, like you still have so much life and vibrance, like you're dragging me into this. And it shouldn't be like that. And so it's just like this powerful moment. But he's like, older means we're still here. So I'm happy for that. So it's like, again, just like there's waterworks the entire episode.
Well, and they fully, so that's the emotional inversion, but then we physically invert it in the Raider attack.
That's exactly right.
For the sake of time.
Perfect transition into this.
Why don't you take us to the Raider attack?
So the Raiders show up, just as Joel said that they would, and Bill is defending the territory, and to fast forward, Bill gets shot. And Frank is now in the caretaker mode. And we get some interesting phrases here, Evan. You had some comments about that.
Yeah, well, first of all, the most poignant thing that we've probably talked about back and forth when we talked about, of all the great quotes that we've talked about in the show and things that we've said that we're kind of pulling from here, I think I probably said the most poignant thing that's been said the whole time. I just said, man, getting shot would suck so bad.
That was a great text you made. It was very insightful. I was like, yeah, it would.
Thank you, Evan. That's correct. That's so yes, good. Getting shot would suck so bad.
Really suck.
Yeah, so he gets shot, and so Frank gets Bill inside and has some whiskey and is kind of making sure that his hands are clean, and he's kind of comforting him and telling him, listen, we're going to be fine. Bill is like, this is the end. Like, I'm dead. And this is the physical manifestation of what he's talking about growing older. This would be rapid. I'm going to die first. This is how it is. And Frank gets to start taking care of Bill in some of the ways that Bill has been taking care of Frank. Their relationship's been primarily kind of emotional give and take. They each have their roles. And there's times in life where those roles get inverted and subverted. And I think it shows a lot about our relationships and our character when they happen. And so Bill says to Frank, you're going to need help. Like, I need you to get in touch with Joel. And so that's just like, oh,
I know.
That
He's
connection
like, I trust
back
Joel
through.
with you.
Yeah, what do you think was so important about that interaction as Bill is kind of bleeding out on the table here? Why does it matter that he would say that about Joel, and how does it set us up for understanding Joel in the rest of the story?
First of all, it shows us that Bill wants to see that Frank is taken care of after he's gone, which is a huge change because he only lived for himself, right? Only for his own survival. But now he's like, I've called Joel. He'll be able to take care of you. It also shows us that Bill trusts Joel now, at least in this. It's the closest thing that he's got to a friend, but it's somebody that he sees eye to eye with, which we'll talk about at the end of the episode. Yeah. And so But Frank is not even having any of that. And he's just like, we're going to patch you up and stuff. And then it kind of ends and you move into this flash forward again. Just like a full lifetime of these two together in this one episode. And the scene opens serenely enough. You've got one of them in a wheelchair, and my first assumption was that it was going to be Bill, and then Frank was going to come out, but it is reversed. And you see that Frank has gotten older faster than Bill.
I think it's our fifth subversion that they use in the storytelling to try and make it to where the foreshadowing is accurate, but there's enough about it that is different than kind of you thought it was going to be. Not too much to where you're trying to predict it like it's some mystery or anything like that, but the theme presents itself in a way that makes you think about it all over again. So it keeps you very engaged, I think, emotionally and mentally while you're processing what's happening, because you fully expect that maybe Bill has died or that he would have been weakened by the gunshot. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's Frank in the wheelchair and Bill's still caring for him. Yeah. So you can tell that what they had expected to happen has actually not gone down in that way. And I think from a storytelling perspective, it's really helpful in maintaining the engagement that we talked about throughout this episode, because this episode flies by.
It does. It's a longer episode, and yet it
hour,
is
12 minutes.
Rich the entire time. So just powerful stuff. This is where we realize that Frank is ill, debilitating disease, and they've been living like this, taking meds and stuff, presumably smuggled to them by Joel.
Right.
But this is not the life that they once had, but it is the serene kind of life they have now. And yet Frank has a decision, and he is putting the brakes on their life as they know it.
Yeah, I think there's visualization that is kind of encapsulated here that I think helps build in the show don't tell aspect of a television show or a movie where Frank has started painting. We haven't really seen Frank paint a ton that I can remember leading up to this. He's always been wanting to beautify. He's had this desire to improve, to create. He talks about it with the town. So if he's in a wheelchair, it means that he was not able to do those things for himself anymore. So it means that Bill has had to, in some way, care and provide the material for him to express himself in that way. And so when Frank is painting, we see that he's having a hard time holding the paintbrush. And so I think it alludes to the end when he's ready to be done, when he can't create anymore, when he can't express and impact the world in the way that he wants to or he has. It's alluding to this fact that he's pretty well at the end and ready to go. And it provides this really sweet. I've used the word tender a lot, so I don't want to use that again, but intimate visualization of his utility, how he expresses himself in the world, how he exerts his influence on what his purpose was in the world and their relationship, and his steady coping with the end as his paintings change in form and substance. There's a lot of landscapes, there's a lot of flowers and everything, and then we get these darker self-portraits. As you can tell, he's kind of evaluating his descent into his condition. That is from a pan that takes 7 seconds over to him sitting in a wheelchair holding a paintbrush. So it's once again, on this next interval of the story, they've given us all of the evidence to tell us that this is a long thought out, substantiated moment and isn't just a snap decision. And they don't waste time talking about it. They show us entirely visually, leading to just these heartbreaking scenes at the end. What did you make of that and that substantiation?
To that same point, while we're getting that visualization of the paintings and stuff, we see Bill outside watering the flowers. Which is such a change for him. And it's something that Frank is no longer able to do in the same capacity that he did. And so you just see them, again, making this life for themselves. And it's also telling the story about their roles and their inability to fulfill those roles in the same way. And yet they're still together. Just like a beautiful sentiment and statement, which is a preface for what comes next.
Yeah, so they get into this conversation, and I think personally that they've had this conversation with each other in their minds probably hundreds of times up to this point.
It sounds like the kind that you would play over and over beforehand.
It doesn't seem like much of a discussion. It seems like a culmination of what's been happening. They're not. There's a little bit of denial and things like that, but you can tell there's a level of acceptance that they both have as they enter into this conversation where Frank communicates to Bill that this is the end. This is the end of my life, and this is what it's going to be. Here's how I want it to happen. This is what I want it to look like. I want us to get married, and this is what I want you to do. I want you to crush up these pills in my wine, and then I want this to be the end, and I want us to go to sleep in our bed, and for that to be it, which is kind of how it started, and how it's going to end. What if he didn't say, I want you to put me back in that hole, and then I want us to do it all over again. No, it starts in that one moment.
Yeah.
I don't have a great way to process that. I mean, it's too much. I think it's emotionally overwhelming for me, and I think it's meant to be.
It is. The way that I would kind of look at it, though, is that this scene really just speaks for itself, and it's not something that we can kind of hammer out. There's a few things that I would note. This is one thing that Frank says to Bill is that I'm not going to tell you that every day was amazing or perfect, because we had a lot of bad days, and I've had a lot of bad days with you, but I've had more good days with you than with anyone else. And that says more than anything else he could have said. There were opportunities in this, and so he says, I'd like to have one last good day with you. And so it's like, this is what we're going to do, and he spells it out for him, and it becomes a beautiful asking him. And even says to him, love me the way that I want to be loved today. And it's like, talk about vulnerability, right? It's like, this is our connection. Like, I'm entrusting this to you, right? And so with this episode, they could have done so many different things. There could have been like a monologue of how much love is and like all this stuff. They don't do any of that.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something really poignant. There's not an arguing back and forth. It really is like our lives together speak for themselves, and this is how it ends. And we're okay with that because we have a richness across the years.
So as they move into the end where they're having the meal and they get married, and I think the rings go on in front of the piano.
In front of the piano, yeah.
So I think there's a lot of...
After going to the boutique and all that stuff, it's just
there's
nice.
A lot of callbacks to those moments of vulnerability, that these are the places that these moments of breakthrough happened. And just like Joel had his kind of memorializing for Tess, they're memorializing these different parts of their relationship. And the paintings in the background in the different scenes create a bit of a rich tapestry of what their life had been, and kind of backfill some of the large time skip that you get in that journey that make, to me, feel like they really have fully lived this kind of lifetime together that they've had. And then we move to the dinner table, and what he wants him to do is he's asked him to crush up what we would assume to be some sort of pills that are going to he's going to essentially overdose and die. And he wants Bill to crush them up and put them in his wine. Now, there's two distinctions that happen here that I think are interesting. So one, they always eat and use this crystal table set of wine glasses. So there's a matching kind of like rocks glass that they have water in. And then they use these crystalline table wine glasses, which personally I don't really care for. I don't like, they're too thick. It's whatever. Yeah. But it's very common for like a table wine that you would have. And so they're drinking their table wine. And I'm thinking, oh gosh, okay, did I miss it? Like, what's going on here? But no, Bill brings out these two more crystalline wine glasses that are kind of a tall red wine glass that are different than we've seen. They drink a lot of wine in this episode, and this is a different one. So not only is the bottle seemingly distinct, but the glasses are distinct, that this is a special occasion. This is the setting that we use for these special moments. Yeah. And he pours the wine, and he crushes up the pills. He puts them in the wine, and he hands him the cup, and he drinks it. But there's a subversion here. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, Bill had put pills in the bottle itself, and so the wine that he also drinks has that same overdose dosage, and so he drinks it full glass, and that's when Bill realizes, like, why are they in the bottom of of the bottle? I think he says, and Frank says, or excuse me, Bill says, this is not going to be the tragic suicide. Like, this is going to be, like, I'm satisfied. And then he says, you were my purpose.
Yep.
And it just levels you, right? Because it's like, wow,
Yeah.
he didn't have that. And he could have never had that.
Yeah.
And then here in this moment, it's done.
Yeah.
And it's such a cool reframing of their story, but also the larger story that's being told in this series.
And they're just direct in what it is, and
Yeah.
then there's just a ton of space to process it as they do. And I think there's a lot to be said on this and these themes, but I think for me, I think the actions and their attitudes, they say everything that needs to be said, and I think they create all the
Again,
space.
we can't do justice to it. Go watch the episode.
Yeah. I think that's it. There's no,
That's it.
at the risk of over explaining and diminishing the power of the moment, I don't have anything else to say about it.
No, but then we move into modern day with Joel and Ellie, and they stumble across Bill's town, and they make their way through town into Bill and Frank's home, and it's empty, abandoned. And
Yeah, Joel knows something's off.
while Joel is searching the house, he tells Ellie to stay behind, and Joel finds their bodies in bed. Ellie finds...
Oh, the door's locked, actually.
Excuse me, the door's locked. My bad. But then Ellie finds a note that says, to whomever, but probably Joel. And this is how they reroute this episode in the larger context. Because the letter on its head, Bill is writing to Joel from one protector, survivalist, to another.
Yep.
And he talks about how, if you're seeing this, we're probably gone by this point. He says, everything I'm leaving to you, right? Just take whatever you need. And he says, I didn't think there was much good in this world. And he begins to talk musing about the world. And he was like, but I found something. I found something worth living for, worth protecting. And he says to him, essentially, I know that you did too. We're the same kind of person. And so use everything. And Ellie's reading this and it says, use all of this that I'm giving you to protect. And then Ellie trails off, but the note says Tess. But the implication here is that Joel has a new purpose, and it is to protect Ellie and this cargo that he's been resistant to. But it reframes the whole thing for Joel.
It does. Bill presents Joel with a charge.
Yes.
And a responsibility in a way that only two people who understand each other in that way, I think, could. And that it takes a lifetime of credibility to make an ask of like that for a person like Bill and Joel, outside of these acute moments of family, access, romance, those kinds of things. This is not somebody who has a lot of seats at the table for being close to them in their life necessarily. And so this, I think, is that moment where Joel has the ability to accept that charge or to reject that charge. And he processes it, no pun intended, when he goes out and finds the truck and the battery that needs to be charged. I don't think there's too much... I think that's intentional, that the battery needs time to charge while Joel accepts the charge from Bill in regards to what he thought he was writing about Tess, but he was writing about Ellie. And when he accepts that, I think that's the moment that we get the full transference of those character elements that we've learned here from Bill, and we're able to then transfer those, at least in some part, onto Joel's character. Thus, developing Joel's character in an insanely indirect way, in a way that makes it more universal and rich. So it's pretty darn well done.
I pulled up the actual words of the letter because I think it's important. Just want to read this one last sort of piece here, where it says, I used to hate the world and I was happy when everyone died, Bill wrote. But I was wrong, because there was one person worth saving, and that's what I did. I saved him, and I protected him. That's why men like you and me are here. We have a job to do. And God help any bleep who stand in our way. I leave you all of my weapons and equipment. Use them to keep Tess safe. And that's kind of the thing. Bill is saying to Joel, you can live closed off, just as subtly, he never knew this, but just as Joel has done with Ellie, closing her off, she's just cargo. But you're wrong. And what a exclamation point on this episode. Just
it's
beautiful.
So true.
Yeah.
And as we kind of wrap up here, there's one last part that kind of closes the episode that gets us ready for what's going to happen in future episodes. And they do a great job of this. But it's Ellie's almost teenage subversion of the rules.
Yep.
They're going through, she sees the weapons in the basement and everything's, he said, this guy was incredible. She's really admiring a lot of these qualities. She asks for a gun and Joel says no, right? So she's not, so very clearly, can I have a gun? Joel says no, this is against the rules. So then we have the scene where Ellie finds Frank's gun in the drawer and she chooses to take it, subverting the rules. So as part of Joel's mandate and acceptance of Bill's charge, he comes back and says, here's the deal. We're going to go see my brother Tommy, and you can come with me, but there's 3 rules. And he goes over these 3 rules that essentially just, they, do what I want you to do and don't fuss up and that kind
of stuff. And don't talk about Tess.
And don't talk about Tess. And he says, repeat them to me. He asks for Ellie to specifically repeat all 3 rules. And Ellie subverts it one more time and goes, I get it. What you say goes. And that's acceptable enough for Joel and creates enough margin for Ellie to feel like she is going to do whatever she wants, knowing that she has the gun in her bag already, that she's kind of almost gets caught putting it in there. So you know that she's already doing something wrong, and that's going to play out in later episodes. What does that say about Ellie's character and how Joel and her are going to have their relationship?
It's exactly how it was in the game, just in a different spot. So after you lose Tess, Ellie says that what you say goes. And it just is a negotiation of this is how we're going to operate moving forward. But you can see Joel starting to let his walls down. Before, he's not negotiating with cargo. Now, he's explicitly sharing expectations for the cargo. Yeah. And what we're going to see is a little bit more personhood in their dynamic moving forward.
Absolutely. And a nice little illusion when they get in the truck where Ellie says it feels like a rocket ship to some things that happen in some of the other games and the way that Ellie feels about the future. So
100%.
Love that. So that's that episode, and I am emotionally devastated. How about you?
As we are. We need a breather. But everybody, thanks for being on this recap journey with us. Hope that you enjoyed it, but we'd also love to know your thoughts. So put your thoughts in the comments. What did we miss? What did you pick up on? And what does this episode mean to you? And if you have any short stories you'd like to share, we'd love to hear them. So thanks so much for watching. Remember, we do this every week. Check out our recaps as well as our interviews with various experts and creators and opinionists. Is that a word? Yep. On Wednesdays. And then on our lecture plays of this specific episode on Tuesday nights. So we'll see you tomorrow night for the Bill and Frank segment of The Last of Us Part 1. With that, everybody, take care, and we will see you next time. Bye.
When you're lost in the darkness,
look for the light.
Okay, bye. Thanks to Husky by the Geek for our theme music, thanks to Nick Smith for our graphics, and most of all, thanks to you. This program is brought to you by viewers like you. We really appreciate you and your support for the show and the channel. We hope things are going well, and we cannot wait to see you in our next episode.